Do you know how to connect to a sharded Redis Valkey cluster? Perhaps you've used Redis, Valkey, or one of the other popular value key stores in the past and learned the basics of how to interact with them. But you haven't figured out how to interact with them when they're in cluster mode. Recently, I designed a very complex search engine that used Valkey running on Elasticache in cluster mode, sharded, to allow for sharding, horizontal scalability, and I wanted to give you some beginner tips for connecting to cluster while they're still fresh in my mind. Connecting is pretty straightforward. You may use redis-cli like normal to connect, but then when you run your first git xyz command, you might get a message like follows: error, moved, and then a port, an IP address, and so on and so forth. This might look like an error, but it's really a redirect. According to Redis's docs, Redis doesn't proxy commands from one node to another. Instead, they forward the Redis CLI or SDK to your choice of node. Think of a 301 redirect, except to the proper node. And that node will contain the data you're looking for. I'm not going to go into crazy detail here why this is necessary. If you need a refresher, check out my YouTube video on Redis sharding. Let's say, for example, that we have 3 shards, each taking 1/3 of the allocation of slots. For simplicity's sake, we'll just say there's 1,000 slots. Shard 1 has slot 1 to 333. Shards 2 has slot 334 to 666, and shard 3 has 667 to 1000. This is a gross simplification, but what happens is when you send a node a git command, it first does a cluster key slots command, and that takes the key and it says which slot will that key be stored in, and it uses that to determine what node will be storing that key. The node checks to see which node is in charge of that slot. If the node that is in charge of the slot is the one that's currently being talked to, it'll just do the request. But if it's not, if it's on a sibling node, then it will do a redirect to the appropriate node, which will do the same check and handling of operations you requested. How do I get rid of that error? If you're using the command line, just add the -c argument. This will enable the cluster mode and allow Redis CLI to open up new connections to the IP address or hostname supplied by the move error we saw above. Complications? Perhaps you're going through a bastion to connect to the cluster running on Elasticache, or you're trying to connect to one running in Docker locally. These redirects can be a bit tricky. In a post coming up, I will give you some tips on how to work around that with the announce functionality. Another fun thing to keep in mind is when designing these crazy scalable systems using Redis or one of its forks is to avoid multi-key operations on its sharded cluster. If you are stuck, don't stress on it. I design a large scalable infrastructure that's cost effective for a living. Feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, I run Cloud War Games where we train people how to do this. So please feel free to reach out. I'm Matt with Schematical and Cloud War Games. Have a great day. Cheers.